Greetings and welcome to another Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team video, where today I'm going over the April stat show for Kill Team. But before we get into things, please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of today's video. Did you like it or not? And remember, I'll have an article version of this down in the episode description below, as well as a Discord which you can check out for free, an affiliate link at Element Games, and a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. But yeah, let's get into today's video. So for today, I'm back again with the April stat show, covering all the tournament stats for April, also featuring the new Nightmare Kill Teams. Once again, all the data is collected from Best Coast Pairings. If you don't use the Best Coast Pairings app, you can either message me or my statsman, which is Smiles Lies Gunfire, who I can't have been able to do this without, via our Discord, well, on my Discord. And once again, remember, it's just collating the stats, so it won't, if you're not using BCP, it won't really be featured. But yeah, it's a good reflection of the past month. We've got the balanced data slate now in full swing, and we have some data using the Nightmare Kill Teams. So let's get into it. So as you can see on the chart, for April overall, with 225 games, Felgor are still the best faction in the game, with a, effectively 60% win rate. Clearly, those nerfs did a good job, knocking Felgor down by making them stay unchanged. But, no one was really surprised by that. And then Blooded doing amazingly well in 164 games with a 57% win rate. Warp Coven at a 57% win rate with nearly 200 games. Mandrakes, with 71 games at a 57% win rate, which is totally fine. Then we have Strikeforce Justian, just on 55%, but 37 games. It's not really reliable. And then otherwise, we have a fairly stable range, because remember, we're looking for 55% to 45% for win rate, so anything outside of that or above or below is not good. So when we look down below 45%, we can actually see Commandos. They're still the most popular faction, 358 games, but they're at 47%, right? So they're doing pretty good. Even Nemesis Claw coming at effectively 49% as well, with a decent chunk of games. But for the underperforming teams, once again, we have Intercession at 44%, so just underperforming, but they are the second most popular faction in the game, so that's actually a pretty good score for them. Kazakin continue to not do well at 42%. They're actually doing worse than they did last month at 159 games. Scout Squad, unfortunately, dropping down to 41% from last month's 45%. Exaction Squad kind of holding at 40%, and then Compendium at 40% overall. And as you can see in the graph, to easily break it down, once again, we've got Felgor up at the top, and then a gradual decline to below. To be fair, for this month, we have a wider range of kill teams within the 55% to 45% range, which is pretty good, because we only have 4 overperforming factions and then 5 underperforming factions, with one of those 5 being the entirety of Compendium. So actually, it's been a pretty good month for April, even though Felgor remain unchanged. Next, we have the April placement data. So this is covering how many times a faction went 3 wins or 1 loss or greater. So they could have gone 4 wins, 5 wins, as long as they just had 1 loss. How many times a faction placed in the top 15% of a tournament? Because remember, it's better than just going first, second, or third, because it scales the larger the event is. So it gives you a better performing idea of how a faction is doing, how many times a faction's podiumed, how many times they've won an event, and how many times they've been picked. So this is all how it's developed in the stats and numbers. So from the graph, we have updated it to be landscape, so it's easier to see on YouTube and on mobile, because these will all be available on the website, but made it clearer. So thank you once again, Smiles Lies Gunfire. But Felgor doing really well with 23 3-1s or greater, 17 podiums, and they won 9 events overall. Hieratech did incredibly well as well, actually outperforming Felgor in terms of 3-1s and podiums, but only winning 8 events. Felgor still the best winning faction. Hand of the Archon won 5 events with 7 podiums. Pathfinders won 5 events as well. And then everyone else, for winning 4 events, we've got Blooded, Hunterclade, Inquisition, Vet Guard, Commandos, Legionary, Intercession, Compendium, and Mandrakes won 3 events. That's completely fine. But you've got an interesting spread. As you can see, Phobos, even though they won 3 events, they actually had a lot of 3-1s and decent podiums. Halfkin, they won 3 events, but had a really high podium ratio at 8 podiums. And then, as you can see, it kind of evens out a bit. Breaches, they did win 2 events, you know, even though their win rate hasn't been great. So they are still doing quite well. And Exaction somehow even won an event as well. And then this is just the same graph, but showing the placing percentage instead. So as you can see, Felgor and Hierotek doing really well with effectively a 30% chance to place. Like out of all the games, 30% of their games made them place in the top 15% of tournaments. Blooded did really well. Chaos Cult had a 33% placement rating, which is incredible. Like it's the highest one. Justian did well as well, but both factions kind of did have lower number of games. But this is a good trend. You know, as you can see, Intercession didn't do too well with placing highly, but you can kind of see how it correlates with Felgor and Hierotek as well as Blooded. Then when looking at GT Plus results, so remember this is for events with 4 or more rounds and 16 or more players, Mandrake's top out at 67%, which is totally fine. It's only 35 games, so it's not truly reliable, but it's a good picture. Then Blooded with 80 games are the best at GT Plus with a 62% win rate. Novitiates jump up to 59% out of nowhere, showing that they're much better at GT Plus. Warp Coven also at 59%. Farstalkers coming out of nowhere, right? Going up to 59% for GT Plus, doing really well there. As well as Hand of the Archon at 58%, and then Felgor at 58%, and Hunterclade at 56%, with Nemesis Claw also jumping up to 55% in GT Plus, which is really good. Then for underperforming factions, we have Legionary at 44, Breaches at 44, just missing out. Then we have Exaction at 43, doing slightly better. Then Halfkin dropping down to 40%, Scouts at 40, and Intercession doing the worst at 40%. And then here's the graph, well, the bar chart to better show it. So as you can see, Mandrake's at the top. Still a small number of games, only 2 weeks worth of games, but not exactly great to see, with Blooded jumping up, Novitiates, and then it gradually declines back until we get to the underperforming factions. Once again, we've got a wider range of healthier performing teams, but we have way more teams doing better at GT Plus, which is kind of worrying, right? You know, Novitiates are always this kind of stealth faction that people underestimate. They still do really well at GT Plus, and it's good to see how it reflects. Because overall, they're kind of okay, but when it comes to long format events, they do much better. And then once again, here's all the April GT Plus placement data, covering the placement data for GT Plus events. So here's the podium data in bar graph form. So as you can see, Mandrake's won 2 events and podiumed exactly 2 times, which is fine. Kazakin won 2 events, so they did pretty good in GT Plus, as well as Commandos and Compendium overall. Commandos still having an incredibly high podium data, right? So for GT Plus, they had 6 podiums and they had the highest proportion of 3 and 1. So they're still doing well because this is after the nerf. Then most teams only won 1 event for GT Plus. You know, there's some amazing player who won a Galapox tournament, for a tournament with Galapox for GT Plus. But also you can see the podiums averaging out a bit more. Phobos once again doing really well at going 3 and 1, and Felgor had 4 podiums, winning 1 event with a still very high 3 and 1 result. And then for GT Plus, with percentage data for placing in the top 15% in an event, Mandrake's max it out at 44%, which is fine. It is a smaller representation of numbers, but, you know, still not a good sign. Kazakin doing much better on this side from GT Plus, along with Commandos. Blooded doing amazingly well, reflecting their win rate. Chaos Cult, once again, showing when it comes to percentages, they're actually performing really well as a competitive faction. Farstalkers, I have no idea what's going on there with the crew. Felgor actually doing a little bit worse, despite how their win rate has kind of remained unchanged. With Galapox, oddly, even though they have a decent representation, it's a smaller number of their players actually placing high. And look at Pathfinders, they have the most wild gap, right? So they have a 19% ratio of 3 and 1s, but the lowest percentage of highly placing event results, which is really weird, right? It feels like the general Pathfinder player base is really swingy in terms of skill representation based on the stats. And now we have GT Long. So these are events with 5 or more rounds and 30 or more players, a new thing we introduced last month. And with 48 games, Blooded are on the top with 67%, showing like this is the second month where they've shown they've done really well at these long format large events. So excellent results from Blooded. Felgor jump up to 66%. They notably did not do well at this kind of format last month, but with 63 games, they are dominating at GT Long. Warp Coven only have 20 games, but they have a 65% win rate. Vet Guard, with only 27 games, have a 65% win rate as well, still after these nerfs, showing that they're still an incredibly powerful faction when it comes to these long format events. Inquisitorial Agents at 62%, Novitiates at 60%, Hunterclade at 59%, and then Farstalker Kinband at 56%. Right, Farstalkers showing like, maybe I was wrong, maybe all those buffs was what they needed for April. Commandos and Galapox even out at, well, Galapox are at 55%, Commandos are at 52%. Commandos doing much better in this kind of format as well, showing they're still a very powerful faction. Then we have a really narrow ratio of 55 to 45%, considering there are less number of games in this kind of format. But if we look at 45% below, so we have Legionary at 43%, Exaction at 42%, well, 43% as well, Wormblade at 43%, Scouts at 41%, so holding their own. Halfkin down to 39%, Kazakin dropped down to 38%, Intercession at 35%, Chaos Cult at 33%, and then Justian, Nemesis Claw, and Mandrakes at 0% because they weren't used. We also did not include Nemesis Claw and Mandrakes for GT Long because it was only like one result or something. It wasn't valuable data. So we left those out for this month, but going on to next month, we should have enough GT Long data for Nemesis Claw and Mandrakes. So here are the GT Long win rates. You can see how kind of crazy they are. Once again, it's a bit swingy because there's less games, but it's showing how these long format events affect the game overall on their factions. But once again, 2 months in a row, Blooded doing really well. And then Chaos Cult oddly dropping off. They're doing great at GT Plus, but not when it comes to GT Long. Galapox holding their own. And then Warp Coven doing really well along with Vet Guard and Inquisition. And Vet Guard were another faction who did really well last month in GT Long specifically, and they're continuing to do that. And once again, here's the GT Long placement data covering everything from wins, losses, 3-1 ratios, all that kind of stuff. How many times a faction's won an event, all of that. So to break it down easily for GT Long, for factions that won one event, so this is once again for events with 5 or more rounds and 30 or more players. So Felgor, Inquisition, Commandos, and Pathfinders all won one of these events. So Pathfinders showing they're still incredibly powerful. I believe Pathfinders won the biggest event of the month, which was 80 players or 86 players in Spain. And then Felgor won, I think, the French tournament. And then I'm not sure who Inquisition and Commandos won, but they did really well, although their win rates don't really reflect it for Commandos. Felgor also had the highest podium ratio for this format with 4 and had 6 3-1s. Inquisitor Agents had 2, Blooded and Hunterclade both had 2. Interestingly, Blooded and Vet Guard, despite doing incredibly well, didn't win any GT Long events. So showing they're doing really well in winning these kind of games in these formats, but not actually winning the events. So Felgor still showing their power as well as Commandos. And then for percentages data, Felgor with a 31% placement data for the top 15% in tournaments, doing really well. Blooded once again having an amazing month, really likely to go 3-1 or greater, as well as really likely to finish in the top 15% of a tournament, showing they're just a really solid faction to pick. They're not winning as much events as they are, but they are showing that they're a really reliably powerful faction, and then it just evens out as it goes on. And once again, we have a lot of 0% results for this because, especially in GT Long, there's less events and not many factions do that well in this kind of format. And then once again, this is the April performance data. So this is like collating all the stats that we have to try and get more sensible average to see how well a faction does in terms of winning, as well as placing high or winning events. So it's trying to get a mean average and then just kind of extrapolate data from that. So this is all the numbers, and here is the chart. So as you can see, Felgor still the best, right? They still have the most the highest win rates with a really good placement data. Then oddly we have Blooded, who have the highest placing data out of all the factions at the moment, but their win rate has been good, right? It's not as good as Felgor, right? But they have a high win rate, but not as well as winning events. So there's an interesting correlation there. Hunterglade having an amazing month. Then you look at Warp Coven, they have a really high win rate, but really low placement data, and they actually haven't won many events. Galapox kind of doing a similar thing or doing better than Warp Coven. Wormblade have dropped down a bit. Vetguard have gone up, which is interesting. Commandos have dropped back down with their win rate, but they have really high placement data as well as winning events. Nemesis Claw doing great. And then we have Kazakin, who have a really bad win rate, but have a really great placement data. So remember, they actually won an event. They're actually doing really well in terms of winning events with placing as well, but their overall win rate is quite bad. Scouts not doing great. Intercession doing quite badly as well. And then oddly, Void Dancer Troop, who I forgot to mention this entire video, have just been sitting perfectly in the middle. Right? They haven't actually been doing that badly. They even won an event. So Void Dancer Troops have been doing actually fairly well for a team that everyone has kind of said they're probably dead. It turns out they aren't. They're just still really solid. And once again, we get to the compendium data. So here's all the compendium win rates. And here it is in graph form. So this month we have Comorite doing the best. Then Imperial Guard, so 63% for Comorite, 56% for Imperial Guard. And then underperforming factions, we have quite a lot, but that's due to how swingy compendium factions are. And then here's all the compendium placement data. And here's their event rate showing a quite weird set of numbers, but it's kind of because compendiums have a low player base, a low rate of games. They're still used, but it's kind of hard to use their data anywhere reliably, but it's interesting to see regardless. And then as always, here's a list of some of the events. But I mean, we've got a whole list of all the events we've used for April, but this is just a quick snapshot showing you how much of some of the events we've used. So as you can see, like you've got Spain at 80 with the largest events of the month. Then you have, like Hell Patrol, you have the Manchester Tournament, King of the North, lots of notable events from around the world, which we just like to show we are actually actively collecting data and how we validate it. So overall for the April data, we have kind of what people expected, right? Felgor still dominating the game. No one really thought that would change. Then we also had Commandos. They've dropped down a bit in terms of win rates, but they're still doing really well when it comes to placing high and winning events. So they've kind of been nerfed overall in terms of the general player base, but not when it comes to actually still playing at the high levels. Vetguard still doing really well. Shout outs go to Void Dancer Troop, who are just holding at 50%. And as I said, they actually did win an event this month. Still doing actually pretty well considering how, as I said, everyone thought they kind of got gutted on. Unfortunately, Scouts did worse this month. We've still got underperforming factions. Hunterglade did really well, finally breaking their losing streak to do really well this month. Blooded had probably the best month overall. And then Mandrakes, from what we can see so far, are just broken, right, from the win rates. And the data, they did win 2 events, really like 2 large events as well. So it's not like they're blips. It is only 2 weeks of data for the Nemesis Claw and the Mandrake kill teams. But Nemesis Claw looking solid, averaging around 50 to 55%. Mandrakes, 57 to 60%, 65%. It's probably only going to get worse, everybody. Like in May, they're probably going to be the best performing faction, but we'll see, right? We'll see. It could be wrong. Could be wrong. It's interesting because also Warp Coven are doing really well. Maybe too well, right? They might have been overbuffed, but we'll see. People are still getting used to that faction. And for Warp Coven, they're a really interesting faction once you get used to how to play them. I think once people learn more their tricks and changes, I think that will come down a bit. Wormblade did worse this month. They're still doing really well overall, but they're no longer above 55%. And then as we could see, we saw the interesting changes once we got to GT Plus and going up to GT Long, because Novitiates did better the more we went to longer and larger events. With Vetguard and Blooded, even though they didn't win any events at GT Long, they actually were 2 of the best performing factions. But Felgor's still a dominant menace, so we're going to have to endure at least 2 more months of that, which is fun. But it's an interesting month, right? Interesting month. We've got a wider range of healthier performing factions, which is good. And even Kroot. Kroot did really well this month. I have no idea, right? No one expected that. They've just done really well. Maybe Maybe it will hold. We'll see. Things always get a bit weird after the first month of a balanced data slate because you have more factions being played more if they got buffed, and it will see how people get used to it. So May will be the really interesting month because we'll have a full month of the Nemesis Claw kill teams, and we'll have more events. So it's going to, like, we're already growing more and more with events. So it should be really, really interesting. So I can't wait to see what happens. But thanks again, always goes to Smiles, Lies and Gunfire, who was able to sort all this out for me. And that's pretty much it for me today. But before we go, please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of the stats. Did you like it? Is there anything we missed or changes you'd like to see? Remember, I'll have an article version of this in the episode description below with all the images if you just want to download them. And I've got a Discord you can check out for free in the episode description below, an affiliate link at Element Games, and a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. And I'll quickly shout out my patrons. So for my adepts of the crit, I have Tom, Supercow, Sam, Nick, Kenzie, John Thomas, Graham, Freeman, David, Dave Meets World, Dad of Goldens, Ben, and then for my veterans of the crit, I have Samja. So thank you so much for all your support. It really means a lot to me and helps support the channel. But yeah, I've got a packed week this month, something dark soon, but it's really interesting. The stats are quite good in like a hopeful way. If you just ignore Felgor and Mandrakes, we've got a nice shake up in the meta. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens, especially with all the events we've got coming up and as it goes into June as well as summer. So it's really cool. But remember, no matter what the win rates say, there's always a chance to win as long as you can roll a crit.